Good morning, everybody. So we'll start off, I'll give you a brief outline of the presentation. I assume everybody can hear me okay? Yep. So I'll explain who the project partners are, explain a little bit about the research project, process monitoring, what the key objectives are, data recording, big data, how much data do you actually want to acquire. Then we move on to the data analysis. I'll give some examples of the data analysis. Then we'll also use how the QA department is using some of this information for the QA checks. Then also traceability. We'll see the benefits of using the system for traceability, give an overview of it, and then look at the future traceability side of things. And then Danny is going to take over and cover future data analysis. So the project partners for this project is Queen's University, Ryobi Aluminium Castings, and it's a project funded by Invest Northern Ireland. And the title of the project is Improving Cast Part Quality Through Process Optimization. So we're trying to look at the high pressure die casting process. We're trying to record process parameters. We're marking the castings. We're recording the part quality at the end of the process. So what we want to do is compare the process parameters which make a good part, compare the process parameters which make a bad part, so that we can try to understand which process parameters are key to making a good part, why do certain parameters make a bad part. So if we can manage to do this, we can ensure that the die casting machine is running at its optimum settings and we are making more good parts in this specific band. So the idea is to try to make things as optimized, as economical as possible. So the process monitoring, the key objectives are to gain a better understanding of the factors that affect the part quality. We need to monitor the die casting process. We need to maybe add sensors to the die casting machine so we can acquire more or different information. We also need to be able to record the information. We need to record the defects in-house and ideally at the end customer, at their final machining line or their assembly stations. We want to compare the process parameters between the reject and the good castings. We need to review the process production via statistical analysis software, JMP for example. And then if we can compare the process and use something like JMP to analyze the information, we can identify key aspects and then modify the process control so that we can reduce these defects which occur. Then we want to use visual analytics, which Danny will explain more on, to create a decision support tool for the casting process. The end goal ultimately is to reduce our scrap rate, both internally and at the customer, and ultimately to increase our competitiveness. So first of all, we've got large die casting machines. There's an awful lot of information can be obtained from the die casting machine. So what do you record? What information do you want? What do you need? Well, it's a good question. Unfortunately, I cannot tell you exactly what you want and what you need at this point, but hopefully later on in this year, we will know more. But we want to record, for example, the shot number, the time, slow speed, fast speed, any information we can get from the die casting machine, we want to be able to record that in a database. So with Ryobi, they have basically it's a specialist data acquisition equipment, which is linked to the die casting machine, and it's called an RDM system. So it records the casting process, and records the process parameters. It also assigns a unique number, which is then dot matrix marked on the casting. So then we can link that specific casting to the specific process parameters which were used to generate it. Laser marker. And then we can see here, just shows part of a casting, so we can have a 2D matrix, and then beside it we also have human readable code. The RDM system itself has got a certain amount of intelligence. If the casting is produced within preset limits, it's seen as a good part, it's marked up, it moves on to the next step in the process. If, however, it is outside of those preset limits, it's scrapped and it will not move further on in the process. So we have all of this information produced from the die casting machine. So it's held as individual CSV files, which are basically Excel files, on the RDM computer on the die casting machine. So they're not easily accessible. We can't easily get information from that. So what we've had to do is to run a few scripts which can look at the die casting machine computer, see which die has been running, copy the information across, and then it'll also edit the RDM data. It'll add, for example, the die casting machine number, add the die number, the product, and any other information we want added to that specific column or that part. Then we have to clean the information up because there's an awful lot of unnecessary information in these CSV files. Clean it up, standardize it so it can be easily read into SQL database, and then run a BCP or bulk copy program in order to bring it into the SQL database. So whenever we have all of this production data in the SQL database, we can easily access that information. So we can look at it through a bit of software which is called QUB View, so you can view the information, view the production parameters, or you can use also RCPR, which is called Ryobi Cast Part Recording Software. So it records part quality and information about the quality side of the process. So this little script runs 3 times a day. There's no need for it to run quicker because it takes about 12 hours from the part is cast until it gets to the machining line. So we don't need to update it every hour or every 20 minutes. That's just unnecessary. So whenever the casting goes through heat treat, comes through to the PCI machining line, it goes through the machining line, and at the end of the machining line, there's a terminal setup, computer, touchscreen computer, and a scanning system. So we have developed a bit of software. So the casting is scanned, then the software looks at the database to get information, for example, the die number, the cast date, the shot number, and then it records it locally, or it records it on the screen, and then the operator determines if the casting is good, or if it's a reject, or if it's a rework casting. So if it's a reject casting, it is recorded by defect type, defect location, and that's sent off the database. It's recorded. If it's rework, it goes for its rework process. Then at another terminal, the operator scans the casting into a cage, and we have a unique 2D matrix, a unique barcode on the cage, so we know which 36 castings are in that cage. So we can identify on the shop floor that if we're looking for a specific casting, we know it's in cage number 25 or 35 or wherever it is in the plant. So it makes things easier to identify. So it does. And yet again, if they record the scrap, it's by defect type and location. So then, as we know, we've got all these cages produced. We've got our unique barcode on the cage. So whenever we send that to the customer, before the castings leave the plant, they're scanned against a shipping number. So we know when the castings actually leave the plant. So we can look at the system and see what's in the plant and what's actually left. So if there is a resort, we can easily identify where the problem parts are in the process. So from this then, we have full traceability of all castings going to the customer. We've got a full breakdown of rejects and reworks from the PCI line, so we can look at this information and identify trends or increase in scrap rate by a particular die type, for example. So we've got our casting information on our RDM database, then we've got our machining recorded at the end of the machining line, and then everything is accessible through a SQL database in the middle. And we also, from the machining line, there is a leak test database as well, so we can record because the castings are all uniquely marked, as they go through the leak tester, their leak test values are recorded and held in the database. So we can look a part up, see which machining line it went through, see what the leak test results are, to identify if that casting's good or if there's any issues with it. The next thing is we're recording an awful lot of information. So the term used now is big data. It's all part of Industry 4.0. So it's a term for data sets so large or complex that traditional data processing application software is inadequate. So that's why we're using JMP to analyze its information. We can't really use Excel because there's so much information. It makes it very difficult. JMP is a specific software developed to be used in this method. Other factors with big data are how to capture the information. Well, we're capturing it through our own data acquisition system, which works very well. Then how do we store it? IT is always complaining. We don't have enough space, we can't give you any more storage, there's always issues, they're always complaining about something, so they are. Then data curation, how long do we need to keep it for? Depends on the customer, depends on ourselves, how long do we want them to keep it for? How do we want to share it throughout the plant, in other sites? Also, how do we want to transfer it, visualize it, query it? The other factor is that what counts as big data varies very, very much. It's very dependent on the capabilities of the user. If you've only got a couple of hundred parts, you could almost do it in paper. If you've got a couple of thousand parts, you can easily do that in Excel. If you've got tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of parts, it's not so easy looking at that in Excel. So that's why you use JMP, or that's why we're using JMP for that side of things. So how much data? If you're thinking, as I said earlier, IT department are going to go mad. We can't store all this information. Very, very difficult. So from one of the products, it's been running for roughly 18 months. On the RDM database, it's about 700,000 records. There's about 80 columns in the database. From the quality database, there's just under 700,000 records. And then yet again, in the leak test database, there's just under 700,000. So the amount of information that actually is in the SQL database is surprisingly small. It's not actually that much. You're talking roughly 7 gig for all of that there. So it's quite easy to manage. It's not that painful to store and to use. So we've got all this information. We've got our RDM database, we've got our quality database. We want to be able to link them all together, including the leak test database, so we can actually see which process parameters make the good parts, which process parameters make the bad parts, so we can try to identify correlations between certain process parameters. So we use it's a bit of software to display data and trends. And then we also, it's possible to compare the dies and the die casting machines, because for us, we're recording 4 different die casting machines, and you would think the 4 die casting machines run at exactly the same rate, at exactly the same cycle time, doing exactly the same thing. And that is not true. They seem to have their own behavior. If the 2 are compared, there are distinct differences between the 2 of them, or the 3 of them, or the 4 of them. So because you buy 2 die casting machines does not mean that you will get exactly the same process from the 2 machines. So I'll give you some examples of the data analysis. So this is just the interface that we use, or the guys in Ryobi use, particularly in the quality department. So this shows the QEB software. So this is information whenever the castings have been processed. So we can see here the yellow ticket number, the die number, number of parts in a cage, 36 parts in a cage, where they came from. PCI is normal production. Then there are impreg returns. So we know which parts have been returned from impreg. We know which parts have been reworked. In this case, it's DevCon. We know when the cage was completed. when that cage was removed from the end of the machining line. We know also the shipping number. We know when the part was shipped, so we can identify which cage went on which shipment on which day. So it's quite good on a traceability side of view. We can also, we can also then, if we want to look at a specific cage, we can identify and have a look at the contents of that cage. We've also set it up to try to make things a little bit easier for the user. So different dies have different colours, so you can clearly see if there's a mixture of different dies on the same cage. And also it gives a list if they're impreg parts, DEFCON parts, and on the right hand side we'll a QA check. So if there's any issues, it'll come up with scrap and it'll show that there may be a few parts that need to be removed from that cage. So we also have got production information from the end of the machining line. So we have live information. It's basically as soon as an operator scans a casting, that information is recorded in the database so we can have access to it. So here, for example, between 11 o'clock on the 1st of March and 11 AM on the 5th of March, we processed just under 2,600 parts. Of that 2,600 parts, there were 84, 3.2% DEFCON, 2.6 impreg, and there are also chip out, leakers, and so there's 2.1% were reject parts. So that information's all live. Press a button, you have it there. You don't have to go through a paper chase trying to see which way the operators have been recording their scrap parts. You can also identify the die numbers of the scrap parts. So it's all very, very useful information, and it is at your fingertip. Also, another way of presenting information is just, in this case, it's just a pie chart. So we can see our production data, production breakdown, and reject breakdown. And this can be separated by die number or date fields or whatever way it wants to be broken down. Also, from the machining and leak test, if we have a problem with a leak tester, we can identify if it has been a specific leak test circuit or if it's been a specific leak test table. So all of the information is recorded. We can also know which casting went through which machining operation. We have a CNC 1, 2, 3, 4. 1 and 2 are for up 10, 3 and 4 are for up 20. So if we have a tool break in machine 3, we'll be able to identify which castings then were processed through CNC 3 between a specific time. Yet again, we can look at our leak test values, so we can put our start and end date and time in. We can see how many parts went through the leak tester, if they're good, if they're impreg, if they're leakers, which leak test circuit failed. We can separate by die number to see if a specific die number has a higher rate of leakers, and also if there's a specific circuit which is more prone to leaking. So for the quality guys, it's very, very useful in order to get information out of the system and see actually what's happening at the machining line. It's also possible to scan a casting or put the information in on one of the castings. So if just the die number's put in, the date is put in, a unique barcode, or sorry, unique number is put in, and then you've got your leak test values, when it went into the machining line, when it came out of the machining line, and then here at the bottom, which cage it went into, when it went into the cage, and then also if it has been shipped. So lots of useful information sitting there, easily attainable. So for QA checks, we had to make a few changes because it was the same product, however, they were running Euro 6.1 and 6.2 versions at the same time. Visually, the parts are very, very similar, so there had maybe been a few issues where there was a mixture of 6.1 and 6.2 in the same cage. Customer doesn't like that when he gets a mixture of parts when he's not expecting them, so therefore it was trying to foolproof or implement a method so that the QA department could check a cage to make sure that the correct parts were on that cage before they went to the customer. So in this case, the operator got a little Lynx tablet, and they just scan the barcode on the cage. And for 6.1 parts, it should be a white label. For 6.2 parts, it should be a blue label. So this one obviously should be white, so the operator checks it's white. All the parts are good, great, no problem. However, if there's a mixture, if somehow or another the operators manage to put a mixture of the 6.1 and 6.2 parts on the saved cage, they will get a nice visual indication that they should hold that cage and they should not process it. It should not go any further, so it's written, do not ship, do not move. So that has worked very efficiently on a couple of occasions to ensure the parts do not leave the plant. So one of the biggest benefits of what we're doing is there's real traceability from the casting to the customer. The way I look at it is we've got the information of when the casting's born, we know what stages it goes through, and then when it's a teenager, it leaves and it goes to the customer. So it's kind of, we're looking at it from the age of 0 to 18, then it goes on and becomes an engine and continues its life. So we understand the earlier parts of how it's produced. So we have a link to the cage number, to the 36 castings in the cage. We have a link to the shipping number. It's also possible to contain trial parts, so they cannot be scanned by the scanning system at the end of the machining line. It'll come up with a message going, do not process, or an error message. And also there's proper machining traceability by CNC, by fixture, by time. So we have live information for the operators, for the QA department, for whoever wants to look at the information. Right. So this is just an overview showing die casting, RDM computer, PCI line, shipping, Jevco customer, and all been looked at by the process overview software. So ultimately, future traceability is to have a 2D marking on all of the castings. So we want to have a 2D marking on any new products coming in, so we can apply the same method to these other products. And now I'm going to pass you over to Danny to continue with future data analysis using visual analytics.
So thanks Alastair. So let's return to what we're actually trying to do here, the big picture. We have gobs and gobs of data that these machines are producing, and we are not using or utilizing that resource effectively. What we're trying to do is reduce waste, reduce scrappage rates. So what we want to do is look at efficient, smart, elegant ways of working with and manipulating this data in order to get insight, in order to get the results that we want. And the first step of that is we needed to create some sort of traceability through the data from part all the way through to the end. And that's something that we spent several years on, and that's what Alastair was just discussing. Now, in order to use this data effectively, the method that we've chosen to use is something called visual analytics. And visual analytics, a lot of people are using this term, but they're not actually using it correctly. Visual analytics actually came out of 9/11. When the US government stopped and looked at this giant disaster that we had, and they started going back and analyzing the data. They analyzed mobile phone calls. They looked at satellite pictures. They looked at very, very different types of information, very diverse, incompatible types of data. When you go back and you look at that, they could have predicted that 9/11 was going to happen. But they didn't have the tools, they didn't have the capability, and they didn't have the mindset to do it at the time. So the U.S. Department of Defense and Homeland Security went forth and gathered up a lot of experts who developed this foundational document, which is actually called Illuminating the Path, and defined this new research area called visual analytics. The definition of visual analytics is the science of analytical reasoning specifically facilitated by interactive visual interfaces. And that's what makes this different from traditional data analytics. What we're doing is we're taking this human capability that we have, and this, which is well documented and well understood, of the human brain to take in information visually and process it behind the scenes to find patterns and recognitions and relationships that we can't find when we do things like data mining or when we just do straight pattern recognition. It's this really unique way of interacting visually with data and letting our own brains be sort of the supercomputers behind it. So if you're going to implement visual analytics, you need three things. The first thing is you need some sort of a computer and you need your data set. And you do need to pre-process the data, and that's some of the things that we've been doing so far. This is where traditional data mining comes in. This is where you manipulate your data to get it into a good form. You do any of the filtering that you need to do, but you get it ready to operate on. The thing that makes it really unique at this point is this middle part. It's the visual environment. You create a visual environment on the front end that allows the interaction. Now, this is not simply presenting graphs and being able to change the axes on the graphs. This is giving a comprehensive data set to a bunch of people and letting them play their own what-if games, letting them do their own trade-offs, so that as they see the data and the results being manipulated, they can form their own conclusions. The really, really powerful thing about this is what lets you leverage user experience, this knowledge that we have from experienced people, they have in their brains. How do you tap into that knowledge? If you give them a way of interacting with data, then you can leverage their own experience, because that's going to be subconsciously influencing their decisions and their conclusions. The other really powerful thing about having a visual interactive environment is now it lets you talk across the disciplines and across your people. In other words, your shop operators on the floor can play with this at the same time as your business people can play with it, at the same time as your managers can play with it and your engineers can play with it. If you have them all in the room at the same time, and you're playing with the same set of information and manipulating it, they're all going to see different things in that data, but together they're going to come to a conclusion. So what we're saying is that if you do this, you bring in this human element, and you put these humans in the loop, that you're actually going to have decisions and conclusions that are superior, rapid, traceable, and defensible. So we're going to try and do this with all of this data that we have. And the first part of defining what we're calling a decision support tool is this idea of a defect evaluation system. And we're not really going to talk too much about that now. But on top of that, what we're going to do then down here is take all of this experimental data that we have, put it in a loop with this visual analytics, this defect evaluation system, so we know how to quantify these defects. Link it in with simulations. I'll talk a little bit about that at the end. And at the end of it, what we're going to do is we're going to see what are these characteristics that produce positive results and negative results. And more importantly, what is the insight that we're getting out of this information, and what are we going to do with that? When we do that, the outcomes that we're expecting is basically a more robust process control. And by robust, I mean insensitive to change, and reduce scrap rates. So what I'm going to show you now, so I just spent a lot of time saying, oh, it's so important to be interactive, it's so important to be interactive, and here I am showing you a static PowerPoint presentation. So there's no getting around that right now, but I do want to show you examples of the types of data and the types of characterizations that we're looking at. So one of the categories that we can look at right here is human factors analysis and how that goes into it. So my static graph right here is showing the percentage of defects, the type of defects by operator. And so each operator is given a number. And just from presenting it this way, I can very clearly see that certain operators are accepting and rejecting different castings. Now this in and of itself will show you a trend, and that's data analytics. Visual analytics is when I go in here and I change what time of day they're working at, what type of defects. When I look at a smaller, maybe I'm just looking at the month of July, everybody's going on holiday. Maybe I'm going to add in the database for weather. Maybe we're looking at humid days. And we're taking very diverse pieces of information and seeing how are we changing? Do the results change? How are the patterns changing? The other thing is that by itself, this isn't telling me if an operator is good or bad. Because this operator may be very, very good at spotting defects. Or this operator might think it's just faster to say, yeah, that one's bad, yeah, that one's bad, and throw them out. So we can't assess the quality. That's where the human has to come in and say, I know that person. And that person has really good practice. Maybe we need to go off and look at how this person is doing it. Or, no, this person is rejecting too many parts. Maybe we need to look at further training. So how you interpret the information, again, has to come from the human side. We can also look at parameter characterization. Now here what we're looking at is scrap rate in terms of percentages. We've got a histogram of the total number of parts produced in the center, and we're looking at temperatures. So the first thing that you can say very quickly is, oh look, I've got high scrap rates over here. But at the same time, I'm not looking at a whole bunch of parts. I don't care that much. So maybe even though I'm going to say, okay, down here is a temperature range where I have higher scrap, if I don't have a lot of parts, I don't care. So what I really want to be doing is looking up in here in this middle part and saying, well, is that an acceptable scrap rate? And does that have any correlation with these other types of scrap? And so interactively, I'm going to go in and I'm going to change my temperature scale. I'm going to go in and change the size of my database. I'm going to go and I'm going to overlay my operators on this and see if I have any sort of conclusions or patterns that are emerging. Another example of parameter characterization, again, we're looking here at fast stroke time. Our output here is in terms of chip out porosity, good and rework. We've got the different types of defects up there. And clearly, presenting this many data points is you're starting to see some clustering. But not only that, if you take it a little step further, you're going to say, okay, this is an area that maybe, am I saying that these clusters are good? But if I overlay the data of how many parts I have, you're going to say, okay, even though just given this information, I may want to say, okay, here's my fast stroke time because I'm getting a lot of very positive clustering right here, but I'm only producing a very small amount of parts in there. So what I really want to do is say, okay, let's explore the area where my fast stroke time is between 2.4 and 2.55. And resetting my machines there may produce a more positive result. There's different ways of presenting visual information that works differently for different people. And so part of the VA environment is that you can toggle. Maybe I want to see a bar graph. Maybe I want to see a bubble chart. Maybe I want to see a pie chart. That kind of interactivity is individual, but also provides different sorts of insight. So just an example, here's a bubble chart that allows us to show the percentage of parts by the type of defect for different machines, machines 6, 13, and 14. And finally, where are we going with all of this? Once we finish developing this enormous visual analytics environment, what we want to do is say, okay, we want to go back and we want to couple it with physics-based simulation. What that is going to allow us to do is when you have a repeatable physics-based process, you're going to get a perfect result every time. When you have an empirical database, which we have from actually running the machines, now we have a database that's full of noise. By comparing and contrasting these two things, what we're going to be able to do is identify what external factors that maybe we haven't thought of. Things like, is a storm brewing? Is it humidity? Is it holidays? Is it holiday season in terms of when people are going on holidays, maybe their brains aren't in the game, operator, human factors issue. We're going to be allowed to look, it's going to enable us to identify some of these noise factors and see where the overlaps are, what really is a physics-based problem that we can deal with, and what is a noise variable that we can deal with. So that's basically where we're going, and that's all. Okay.
Thank you.
So,
So